Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Simon Fraser University Department of History's 2022 edition of History Reads. SFU History Reads is a public book club that discusses timely works of historical interest to bring the study of history to our community. This year, our public lecture and outreach activities follow the theme highlighting decolonization. With that aspiration, we are delighted this evening to discuss David Diop's International Booker Prize winning novel, At Night, All Blood is Black. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce myself and the lands on which we host today's event. My name is Dr. Bidisha Ray. I am Senior Lecturer in Modern South Asian History at SFU. I'm joining you this evening from my home in Pitt Meadows, which is the traditional territory of the Katzie First Nation. Our department, History, is housed in Simon Fraser University's Burnaby Mountain campus, which was built on the traditional, ancestral, and present-day territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It is our great privilege to live, work, and flourish as uninvited guests on these sacred lands. Our panelists today are Dr. Roxanne Panchasi, Dr. Lauren Faulkner-Rossi, and Daryl Ferguson. Let me introduce Daryl first. A young and gifted historian, Daryl is an undergraduate student at Simon Fraser University. He is a criminology major. He was born and mostly raised in Ghana, where much of his family still remains. Daryl has taken a number of courses on the history of the Global South and was one of my finest students in an upper division seminar on post-colonial India. Daryl is an avid reader who is interested in a range of matters pertinent to life in formerly colonized societies. Welcome, Daryl. Dr. Roxanne Panchasi, Associate Professor in History, is also the Associate Dean of SFU Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies. She is a prolific scholar, historian, social commentator, and award-winning teacher whose specialisms and interests span a wide range of cultural objects and moments from the French past. Finally, Dr. Lauren Faulkner-Rossi is Limited Term Assistant Professor of History at SFU. She is a widely published scholar and expert on modern German history. A PhD alum of Brown University, Dr. Rossi held a faculty position at the University of Notre Dame in the States before joining SFU. Her most recent publication is a fascinating narrative of a Holocaust child survivor's memories. The book we are discussing today, as you know, is the winner of the 2021 International Man Booker Prize, which is possibly the most prestigious award recognizing excellence in translated literature. David Diop's At Night, All Blood is Black was first published in French in 2018 with the title Frère d'âme or Soul Brother. Selected by students across France to win the Goncourt Prize for high school students, David Diop's literary masterpiece has been hailed as a powerful, hypnotic, and dark novel of terror and transformation in the trenches of the First World War. Now, let me just talk to you about how tonight's event will progress. Tonight, our panelists will each take about 10 minutes to discuss their personal experience of the novel, and then I will invite them to respond to each other. The audience, after that portion is finished, will be invited to use either the Zoom chat function where you can type your questions or comments, but you will also be at that time invited with the option to turn your video and microphones on and speak directly, should you so choose, to any panelist or the entire panel. As event moderator, if you are typing your questions on the chat function, I will read back those questions and comments to our panelists. You may pose a general question or a question directed to a particular panelist. We're looking forward to a very lively and interactive discussion, and we will aim to wrap up our event by 8 p.m. tonight. So without much further ado, thank you very much for listening to me. I invite Dr. Roxanne Panchasi to share her thoughts on the book, please. Roxanne.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
That's great. Thank you, Bidisha, for that wonderful introduction. I always sound more exciting when other people introduce me than I do in my own head. And to Jonathan for the hard work and everybody else involved in making this event happen. I'm excited to be here, and yeah, to everybody for joining. I feel like the rain is cooperating. Where else, what better place to be than cozily on Zoom to talk about a book. So, and I also want to thank Lauren and Daryl for agreeing to be a part of this panel together. So when Bidisha first asked me to be a part of this conversation, I was pretty delighted. I had certainly heard about the book after it was published in France in 2018, as Bidisha said, to great acclaim, including those awards that she mentioned. And the International Booker Prize that followed the publication of Anna Moskovakis' 2020 English translation was, of course, also a very big deal. So I hadn't read the book. I've been busy the past couple of years, but I wanted to for different reasons, including the fact that I'm always on the lookout for newish, not 1,000-page French novels that are available in English translation that I can use in my history classes, and that's not always an easy find for my courses. And just in case there are any undergrads shopping for courses next term out there, I'm going to plug that I am actually teaching the novel next term in my History 319 survey of modern France since the French Revolution of 1789. Shameless self-promotion. In these first minutes that I've been given to share my thoughts this evening, I thought I might just highlight a few of the things that struck me most. I was reading as I took the book in as a reader in both French and English. And as a historian of modern France with recurring interests in war, empire, gender, and memory, and also as someone who thinks about how to work on those things, write about this, and teach those things where I live in so-called Vancouver and or so-called Burnaby on unceded and traditional Indigenous territories during an era of reckonings of various kinds with respect to colonialisms, racisms, historical and ongoing forms of violence against individuals and entire communities. So I picked up my copy of the French version of Diop's novel. I'm just going to share my screen, actually. I wanted to show some images here. That on? Can you all see that? Great. So I picked up my copy of the French version of Diop's novel, Frères d'âme, this past summer on the first research trip I'd managed to make to Paris in a while. I got it at the FNAC, and anybody who's lived in France or been to France knows this chain store that I'm talking about, where you can buy books, music, electronics, and like literally anything you want at the FNAC. The pocket-sized edition I picked up for 6 euros and 20 centimes. Slipped into my bag and had it there for my entire trip, and I've had it in my bag for weeks, leading up to this event. It's the one that's put out by the Édition Point. It was put out in Édition Point in 2019, so it's the one on the top left, and I have it here with me, the physical copy of the book. It's smaller than the original, which is this one here that came out. The Seuil edition, and unlike this simple design of text against a plain background common to so many French publications, the Édition Point cover, and I'll just come back to that image on the top left, is colorful and features an illustration of an African soldier by Nicolas Otero, an artist especially known for his comic book illustrations. I'm going on about this to plant the seed of a thing or two that we might talk about more as we go. The first has to do with the relationship between the dimensions and weight of this book, like the physical size, as opposed to its historical significance, its psychological and emotional heft. I don't have a formula for thinking through the ratio between these because I don't think there is one. But as a reader, I kept noticing this difference, partly because I had it in my bag for weeks while I was in France, and then I kept it, was reading it in little bits here and there when I returned, and have had it again in my bag since in the lead up to this event, as I said. I kept noticing this difference between the spareness and lightness of the prose, the apparent lightness of these pages bound together in one sense, and their heaviness in others. And I wonder if and how the rest of you experienced this reading, those of you who have also read the book already. I also thought to share the covers of these multiple editions, and there's the French pocket edition, There's a Dutch one here, an Italian, a Greek, a German, and then of course the English one that I think a lot of you will have read for tonight for this gathering. So I thought to share the covers of these multiple editions because of the different elements of the narrative that they seem to highlight. A soldier or soldiers, illustrated, painted, or in black and white photographs, a landscape, a severed hand graphically altered to evoke movement, vision, a shattering, different shades of color and degrees of light. I bought the latter, the English edition, when I got home later in the summer. Looking at the French and English editions side by side and reading them, first in the original and then in translation, has also given me a lot to think about. And that's something I've certainly done as a French historian before, but not that often in such close proximity, where I read the French and then I immediately read the English after. And it's really given me a lot to think about in terms of translation and how this book works, even just in the French. The titles in French and English sound and feel so different. Frère d'âme, a fraternal soulmate that also plays with the idea of a brother in arms. At night, all blood is black works better in English. It's not quite the same vibe, or maybe it is. And there is that moment when Alpha in the book, the sort of main narrator of the book, discusses the impossibility of translation, a problem that is inherent in the original text as much as those that are translations of the French. The novel is so much about the voice of Alpha Ndiaye, and how that voice reads and sounds in both versions that I read, and in others, I imagine, those German, Italian, Greek, and Dutch versions. It's meaningful, particularly given that Diop has done so much to give us the voice of a character for whom Wolof, rather than either English or French, would have been a first language. And in his simple and repetitive phrases that nonetheless hold great complexity of experience and affect, we learn in specific ways about the relentlessness of the violence of war, of the basic exploitation and inequality at the heart of colonialism, of the fear, guilt, grief, rage, and madness that bleed together and out from the intersections of these forces. There are other voices too, always and throughout: ancestors, parents, Mademba, the voice of duty, a voice that commands, singing voices, the voice of vengeance. The historical significance of a book like Diop's, and for our contemporary moment, can't really be overestimated. The recruitment, sometimes by force, and participation of thousands of tirailleurs sénégalais, the name given to Black African soldiers, regardless of whether they were really from Senegal, in service of France during both world wars, roughly 200,000 in World War I, where 30,000 of these soldiers died, and between 140 and 150,000 in World War II, where another 24,000 were imprisoned or killed. These soldiers also served France in the suppression of resistance struggles in different parts of empire. There is a rich and growing scholarship focused on this history. Public memory and awareness of this complicated past remains limited, however, and the lives and stories of soldiers like Alpha and Mademba remain relatively marginalized in grand patriotic and commemorative projects of recognition and remembrance of wartime suffering and sacrifice. This book speaks not only to the violence of warfare, but to specific contradictions, a will to demean, exploit, and even infantilize the African soldier while mobilizing a projected and imagined savagery against French enemies. Savagery should be in quotes there. And these distortions leading inevitably to judgments about that same soldier's lack of control, his barbarism, the threat he poses to his white comrades, and especially to white women, something that we can talk about later, perhaps more. Civilization and citizenship in the French context have been defined as and through whiteness. These French ways of seeing men of African descent in particular have never entirely faded away. French Republican assimilation has always been something of a lie as much as a fantasy, a set of broken promises from its inception. These not white veterans would not be honored or compensated in the same ways as their European brothers in arms, so-called. And no belated recognition or retroactive payment could ever truly address that material and psychic betrayal. Diop's novel thus addresses a past that has been obscured while pointing up painful legacies into the present. The physical and psychic landscapes of war, of the trenches and no man's land, of bodies birthed from the soil to face death in the mud, uncanny limbs, insides made outside, and the haunting of the living by the dead, the absurdities of the rules of war and of military justice, so-called, violence, sexualized and sexual violence, the blurring of the boundaries between past and present, between reality and fantasy, between following orders and descending into madness. Diop's is not just a narrative world of racialized difference and injustice, it is also a world where these things are worked through sexual desire and pain. This recalls for me the versus habit, the warring soldier's tendency to dichotomize between home and battle, between women and men, between before and after, that the historian Paul Fussell had outlined in his classic study, The Great War and Modern Memory. And I think Erin Wendell is here and knows exactly what I'm talking about. The women, it also makes me think of the women, floods, bodies, and history that Klaus Teweleit excavates so brilliantly in Male Fantasies, his 2-volume epic analysis of German masculinity after the First World War, which, you know, when I thought that Lauren would be here to be a part of this conversation, I thought so much about Male Fantasies reading this book, and about Fussell. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the book, on the historical literature that it brings up for me, and on the themes and issues that I teach when I'm teaching the First World War, particularly with respect to race and empire. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Roxanne. That's
I wanted to say one more thing. Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to show is that Omar Sy, if any of you watched Lupin, the series about the very good-looking thief, the very good-looking Omar Sy is also in this film that was just released at Cannes, that is focused on the lives of the tirailleurs Senegalais. So called Tirailleurs. So that's coming soon. And I don't work for them or anything. I just thought I would alert people to the fact that this is a moment when these conversations are really intense and there's kind of a cultural interest and revived interest in these stories. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Roxanne. That was so fascinating and given us so much to think about. You have some applause reactions already. So I'd like to now invite Daryl to share his feelings and thoughts and his experience of reading this book. And I'd like to remind our audience that Daryl is an undergraduate student, and it takes a lot of courage to say yes to a public event like this. So I would invite you to give him a round of applause and please, support him as he speaks. Go for it, Daryl.
First of all, thank you, Professor Bidisha Ray, for this opportunity, and thank you, Jonathan, for technical work. Yeah, I've never used Zoom like this before, so it's a bit new. But just to start off, I think one of the things I'd like to say is that this was a lot of firsts for me. It was my first time exploring the setting of World War I through this narrative. It was my first time exploring World War I through the eye of the French side. I'd learned about it through the more common view of the Allies, such as the US, Britain, but never France. And also, it had been a long time since I had read a novel from an African author. And the major themes of this book, as mentioned by Ms. Roxanne, of war, humanity, and the dichotomy of mankind, was rather interesting to me as well. We see it throughout the novel, throughout the narration by Alpha, and throughout his descent into becoming the very thing that he is viewed as, the thing that he is led to believe that he should be in order to survive war. The soldiers of the Senegalese soldiers, the chocolatiers of Africa, as called by his captain, Armand, in both a humorous and also degrading light, are soldiers who are all human and yet are expected to become savages in order to strike terror and fear into the hearts of the German soldiers, the blue-eyed enemies, as they are called. This dichotomy is first revealed in the dichotomy between Mademba and Alpha. The book opens up with Alpha finding Mademba lying on the ground, trying to pull in his organs in a desperate but ultimately futile act. And Mademba's pleas for Alpha to give him a mercy killing. First start off as calmly and a friend-to-friend manner, and as the desperation of his life fading before him sets in, he grows increasingly panicked, and this is contrasted by the calm manner in which Alpha narrates the story. He constantly, throughout the narrative, introduces this idea of religion and duty and faith. The sentences start in God's truth, typically every chapter. And in this way, we see Alpha sort of justifying and rationalizing his narrative. He tells Mademba that he cannot kill him because how would he face his mother and father? How would he face his God? And yet in these same acts, he then, as soon as Mademba dies, he awakens to the fact that what he was doing was not a justification, was not an honorable thing to do, even though he had obeyed the laws of man that you should not kill your troops, you should not kill your fellow man in a war. He had let himself down, he had let his friend down in his final hour. We see this as he drags his friend's lifeless body back, and he's welcomed with praise. He's welcomed with praise as he takes his first victims across the trenches and brings back their hands, with the men viewing him with honor and admiration at how he was able to do the impossible. But that honor and admiration also turns to fear as they soon think to themselves, will I be next? Will I be his victim? Is he truly human? And this idea of humanity is constantly brought up throughout the book in the form of voices. The voices that he hears that inspire him to seek vengeance that are not his own. The voices that he hears of his ancestors expressing disapproval at his actions. The voices of I believe called them the taboo, which was a Senegalese word for the white soldiers, and how they treated him at first with respect, despite their racist views of the Senegalese soldiers as savages, of playing the part of savages, to the fear that they all held for him as the novel progressed. We also see him feel regret and remorse throughout the novel's story. We see it in his inner monologues, in his thinking that he hides from the others, that he hides his humanity from the others because he seeks to play the part of the barbarian. He seeks to put terror in the heart of his enemies. We also see the humanity in the soldiers, or the enemy soldiers, the German soldiers. In the fourth victim that he has, a soldier that Alpha believes to be no older than 15 or 16, and is the only soldier that he regrets killing of the 8 that he killed. And this marks the point where the soldier's attitudes towards him shift from hero to sorcerer to demon even, as his escalation of strange habits of keeping the hands as trophies goes from garishly humorous to disturbing, a fact that Alpha takes advantage of as he seeks to keep them. And this signals his warping humanity. There's also the continuous thought of revenge as a contrast between the two. Mademba, who one would think would have all the reasons to call for revenge, is the first one to try and stop Alpha. He first pleases him to not seek revenge on the soldier, to instead focus on helping him alleviate his suffering, to which Alpha refuses. We see Alpha continually reject the idea of duty, a duty that he finds the racist undertones in how the Senegalese soldiers are always the first across the line. They are sent first to scare the enemy, to tear them, to put the fear into them that they're going to be killed by savages, by cannibals, by monsters. And then they are followed by the white soldiers. The idea of duty is also criticized throughout the book. in that the captain that he once respected becomes a monster in his own right when his troops disobey him. The whistle that would signal their savagery to begin, the excitement of getting to kill enemy soldiers, becomes a terrifying whistle of death as 7 of his troops are declared traitors for not wanting to go up into no man's land and give their lives. And we see the corruption as well involved as a captain uses the threat of losing dignity, of losing pensions for their loved ones, to force the soldiers into obedience, to force the white soldiers into obedience, and uses the threat of a similar fate to force the Senegalese soldiers to do horrible, inhumane acts upon those who were once their brethren. In a similar manner, we also see the fear of the Senegalese soldiers against Alpha, who once was a comrade, but through his actions of keeping the hands of his enemies, has become a symbol of fear. The death and stench of the enemies that swarms him as he killed them in the night hangs over him. It looms over him as a corruption upon not only his physical form, but also his soul. And we see this as well in how he views his departed brother, Bademba, who he both idolizes and criticizes within the same breath. And the book stood out to me historically because it tells a story of a lesser known history. And throughout my education, I've heard of other similar stories of lesser known histories. For example, the history of the female Soviet snipers in World War II, the history of the Battle of Verdun, which in my experience was something that I had never known before up until I had come to Canada. As I had grown up, I'd learned about world history. I'd always gone under the assumption that Canada had remained neutral in the war, but I had later learned out that this was untrue. I had also learned during my time of learning history about the sacrifices of minorities under colonialism, of how the British would conscript soldiers to fight for them in both World War I and World War II, and the soldiers who bravely fought in the hopes that fighting would get them to be recognized as human. And the book was a really interesting read because in terms of the physical appearance, as Roxanne mentioned, I have the English version of the book. And the first thing you see is imagery of the hand being shattered. And for some reason, I imagined the shattering of the hands as sort of knives for some reason, knives piercing the flesh of the hand, which is exactly how Alpha goes about collecting his hands. However, he doesn't also tell this to his companions. He thrives in the mystery of him being dem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word correctly in Senegalese, but that's the word they use. A soul stealer, a soldier sorcerer with mystical powers. This mystical element is reinforced in how he somehow survives the war. Survives long enough that the captain, out of fear of his powers, sends him to the rear in the hopes that he'll be away from the others, that his influence of death will be away from him. We also see in the internal monologues of Alpha that he defies the stereotypes that are placed upon him. He is not a savage, far from it. And each and every one of the soldiers there is only playing a savage for the sake of their lives, for the sake of fighting and also explaining the absurdity that is war, the cold reality of the randomness of a stray bullet can kill you, or a stray mortar shell can kill you. You don't know if even getting up on the steps of the trenches will be your last. In this, we also see the humanity of the enemy soldiers, because they also face the same fate. They face the same threat when they are charged by the Senegalese soldiers. And there's this terror of not knowing which day will be your last, of not knowing whenever the whistle sounds, if it will be your death, that both sides face. We also see the humanity of the soldiers in their anger and rage at the death of their comrades, when one of Alpha's friends, the only white friend he has, John Baptiste, goes and uses one of the hands that he has captured as a tool to taunt the enemy because of his enraged state. And to also harken back to something that Roxanne mentioned about the idea of masculinity. It was interesting how it was explored in the novel as one of the first things mentioned by Alpha after the death of his friend is that for the first time he notices that the trenches that he is in are similar to a woman's genital. It's a thought that surprises him because of how crude it is, and how he would ordinarily never think such a thing. And yet this idea becomes symbolic in the form of the earth that they're on being a womb for the soldiers, that every time they get onto no man's land, they're leaving the safety of the womb. And just to suppose a question rather than actual statement, one thing that stands out to me in his writing is the idea of mysticism, as it's rather different from any other portrayal that I've seen of wars, both World War I and World War II. As typically the bravery of the soldier is not presented as something mystical, but something won through hard work and determination, such as in films like Saving Private Ryan or Dunkirk. No one asks of the white soldiers if they are being powered by magic, armor, or mystical forces. It's seen as just sheer human grit. And yet just by virtue of where they come from, the narrative is shifted onto how he is able to do this miraculous thing. And I'm not sure if I have enough time, but I'd like to say thank you. And that is all I have to share.
Daryl, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for sharing such a sort of wide range of ideas. And you'll have to forgive my maternal approach to you. I was your professor. I can't shake away from. I'm so proud of you. And so, yeah, forgive that. But let's move on to Dr. Faulkner Rossi now.
Yeah, thanks. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes, nods. Thank you. Thanks, Bidisha, for inviting me to this panel. And thanks, Roxanne and Daryl. I've been scribbling furiously. I have the benefit of going last. So I feel like I get first crack at responding to what you said. And each of you gave me so much to think about. And I'm reassured that some of your observations, I think, mirror mine. And there's other things you said where I'm kind of going, I want to unpack that a bit more. So where to start? My experience reading this book, I came to it about 8 months ago. I had heard such good things about it, and all I knew was that it was a World War I trench warfare from an unusual perspective. And then someone else told me, oh, it's really short, so you should have no trouble reading it if you're like slammed with work. So I thought, great, this will fit nicely on my book stand. And of course, after I was about 20 pages in, I thought, oh, this is not short. This is going to sort of haunt me, even if I read it all in one go. And I was right about that. And so, Roxanne, when you were saying, you're trying to make sense of the disproportion between the physical slightness of the book and the psychological punch, I totally understood what you were talking about. So what do I want to say about it? I came at it through the lens of a young white Canadian woman who teaches German history. So I occasionally will teach World War I, but very much from the German perspective. So I have, I think, a very different reading, especially of the first part, where we're in the trenches, than what's been discussed so far. But I think what I'm going to do is sort of wander through the 3 parts of the book, and I get to comment first on the middle, where he's convalescing in the hospital, which we haven't touched on yet, which is in some ways the part that's sticking with me the most. I'll confess at the outset, I still am not sure what to make of the end, and I would love to hear how other people resolved it in their own heads. I'm torn between wanting from the, I think, torn between the European perspective, if you will, of this young man's descent into madness and schizophrenia, and the Senegalese or Western African explanation, in which is much more mystical and culturally specific, in which he might have actually become a dem, and is now two spirits inhabiting one body, if I understand that correctly. So again, this was all very new to me, and I'm still thinking that third part through. I teach World War I as the sort of break between the very long 19th century and the very modern 20th century, which is defined in large part by wars of different sorts and genocide and trauma. And World War I, when I teach it in German history, really sets the stage for this. It's characterized by industrialized violence, in which men are increasingly far removed from the consequences of their actions, and in particular, the impact of their mechanized weapons, in which you have tremendous casualties with no apparent sense, no way to bring meaning to the deaths of literally tens of thousands of young men in a matter of hours. Diop's book and Alpha's experience in particular took me away from this very sort of general bird's eye view of the war and forced me to face what it must have been like for not just somebody in the trenches, but a young man on European soil who was himself not European. And I was grateful to be introduced to that perspective here. I knew of very vaguely the tirailleurs sénégalais, which were put together in the 19th century, I think mid-19th century, and that they played significant roles in some of the battles in France during World War I. But I was struck by Alpha almost immediately, asking me to contest my preconceptions about colonized troops, particularly French troops, being plunged into war in Europe. When he says on page 15, "The unthinkable is what is hidden behind the captain's words," the captain who's asked him to be a certain way in the war. "The captain's France needs for us to play the savage when it suits them. They need for us to be savage because the enemy is afraid of our machetes. I know, I understand. It's no more complicated than that." And so reading that, and I've reread it now several times, we're presented with a protagonist who's seizing agency and who understands completely what's being asked of him in maybe ways that his commanders aren't even fully aware. It made me conclude that up until he's sent to the rear, that he might in fact be one of the sanest soldiers in the trenches, because he was so hyper aware of what he was being asked to do. As we made our way through the days and nights with him as readers, I was struck by his sense that the violence he was committing was somehow illegitimate. This idea that he was going out and facing an enemy almost one-on-one, which you never really read about in World War I. It's always masses against masses. And that this stood in stark contrast to the so-called legitimate violence of battle, which, for instance, the captain was asking his soldiers to wage, sometimes for absolutely no reason, sacrificing their lives for little to no gain. And this, of course, links to what the scene that Daryl pointed us to, the revolt of the Toubab soldiers, the 7 traitorous friends who were essentially executed as a result of their refusal to go over the top. I read Alpha's attempt to come to terms with his failure to assist Mademba, his friend, as an attempt to recover his humanity, even as everyone around him is losing theirs. I read his understanding of, or his making sense of, his inability to kill, to ease Mademba's suffering as a moment of distraction by vengeance, which he then immerses himself in totally in an attempt to sort of relieve himself of his failure. He relives it each night, face to face with his enemy, and he kills each enemy the same way that Mademba has been killed. Only he changes the ending. He grants them mercy in the final minute, right? And it's a very knowing behavior. It's a very informed and deliberate and intentional behavior. So on the one hand, it completely defies the tropes that Europeans had of colonial soldiers at this point, that they were unthinking and savage and would simply do as they were told. In fact, this is very much a deliberate thinking individual who has very specific reasons for waging the violence that he wages. And this too challenged me to rethink how I approach teaching violence in World War I. This is only one example and a fictional one at that, but it's sort of stuck with me, like on an individual, indeed personal level. Soldiers in extreme circumstances tried to make sense of what they were living through. And of course, as a German historian, Alpha ends up personifying deliberately everything that the Germans in particular feared about colonial troops. And it's something that I spend some time on with my students when I teach about the long history of racism in Germany, which is not specific to Nazism and can't be boiled down simply to anti-Semitism. Post-1918, the Germans at Versailles were so concerned that France would station colonial soldiers in the Rhineland that they had it written, or they tried to have it written in the treaty, that they would not send Black soldiers into Germany. And of course, that failed. But the images, and I thought about showing some, and I've decided I'm not going to, the images that circulated in popular and mainstream media depicted in sort of the worst ways these demonic soldiers who were going to come and harm the fatherland. So Diop, I think, is challenging us to rethink who's the savage, right? In ways that are both very subtle, but also very pronounced. So I know I've taken up a lot of my time actually talking about part one when I said I really wanted to talk about part two. I am sort of haunted by the scenes of Senegal that we get in part two. These glimpses of a space and a time that Alpha and Mademba had before they went to war and before they went to Europe. The wrenching loss of his mother, I think, really stays with me, and it inspired me to sort of look into this sort of longer history of slavery in this part of Africa. And I was shocked by one of the stats they came up with. 3/4 or something of colonial soldiers from Africa in World War I had some connection to slavery as early as the first part of the 20th century, which I hadn't known about. So obviously, slavery and colonialism were in no way past for the soldiers that found themselves on European soil. So I'd be really interested in speaking more about that as well. What I want to say in closing, the prose. Roxanne, you mentioned the prose. I want to read it in French because my sense is that Diop plays with language in ways that don't come through in English. So if you've read it in French, maybe you could comment on that. I know that one of the epigraphs that he starts the book with has several double meanings in French that don't come across in English at all. Frère d'âme, soul brother, is also, I think, a homonym for frère d'armes, comrades in arms, right? And then there's the fact that is stated sort of a few times, but quite subtly, Alpha doesn't speak French. So, but this is a story that is coming to us originally in French, and now it's been translated into English. But the thinking apparently is in Wolof, which I'm not familiar with at all, except that phrases like God's truth, which is returned to repeatedly, is evidently something from that language. So those layers, I can sense that they're there, and I only get sort of a very faint scent of them in the English version of this book, which, as I said, is very powerful. I'm going to stop there because I'm really anxious to hear from my panelists again, and also to hear from all the people who showed up to listen to us speak today. So,
thanks so much, Lauren. I think we're doing very well for time. So I would like to invite Roxanne if she wants to respond to any of the things that came out from her fellow panelists' presentations.
Sure. I really appreciated like how close to the book you got, Daryl, in your comments, and thinking through the different characters. I think it's hard to think about what to respond to. There's so much to respond to, but maybe I'll just start by saying, since Lauren, you just brought up this question of language, that, you know, it's hard for me because like I read it in both languages, but I didn't like, I didn't translate it, and I'd read it in French first. So I was just kind of confirming in English, like what, so I can't answer some of those questions about, like, I think that's true. And I did read an interview with Diop about like the deliberate use of a language that would clearly not be the language of a French speaker, but it's written in French. And I think Diop's own relationship to this history is kind of worth mentioning here, like so Diop's mother is white, I think, and his maternal grandfather fought in the First World War, as I understand it. So he has like this interesting kind of relationship to this past and to his own like African heritage. And so I think that's interesting to me in terms of how, like, he wrote the book in French, like what else would he do? But I think the fact that he's writing a book in French that is trying to replicate the thoughts of an African soldier who didn't speak French both reflects like the skill set he has as a writer who writes in French and his own past and history. And then also reflects the like tension between, you know, as readers, us wanting to understand this past, but only being able to get it through this French translation, which is like, it's a translation in the original text, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it's already a translation and then it's translated into English. So I think I felt some of the things that you felt reading it in English, already reading it in French. And you're supposed to, if that makes any sense, because it's already a translation of these thoughts that are happening in another language. I'm not sure if that is totally confused matters more. And then the other thing that I was going to say, I really thought that, you know, both of you the ways that you pointed to the contradiction, to the ways that this soldier is, you know, expresses different forms of resistance to the caricatures of Senegalese and other African soldiers, and also to these kinds of contradictions between the violence that's asked of him and others like him, and the violence, like the boundaries that are put on, like what are the rules of the game and the rules of civilized warfare and these kinds of things, which of course World War I completely blew to smithereens anyway, in various ways. I think, if I'm honest, there were moments when I read the book, when I started the book, and it was probably because even though it was short, I realized I couldn't just read it in bits. I had to like sit down and actually just read it in one day. Like I kept starting it and then realizing I had to do that. And I didn't like it. And when I say I didn't like it, I don't just mean like it was difficult. I mean that I was very uncomfortable with what felt to me like a narrative that was reenacting all of the things that I do teach about these caricatures, and that Diop was like making this happen. And I don't know how I feel about it in the end. Like, I'm not sure. I think I'm still uncomfortable with it in some ways, because I think, like, when I think about teaching it, I worry about that. Because I think the nuances of the self-knowing and the aware Senegalese soldier in relationship to those caricatures is something that's difficult to tease out. Like, I don't think it's obvious. And I also, like, I mean, the sexual violence in the book is also particularly troubling to me, not just because it happens, but because I wonder about those choices. And yeah, so those are my jumbled responses. Like, I think it's a very difficult book to be critical of because of who Diop is, and because of the importance and significance of this book at the moment that it's arriving. But I'm kind of ambivalent about the and I'm sure I'm an outlier in some ways about this, I'm kind of ambivalent about like what it does to some of those characterizations of Black masculinity and in warfare and beyond, like right up to the present. Like I guess I worry about it, and particularly when I think about teaching it.
Thank you, Roxanne. Daryl, would you briefly like to address anything that's come up in the discussions by Drs. Panchasi and Rossi?
Sure. I think I can also address Dr. Roxanne's concerns about the portrayal, because I also had those concerns. Well, I don't teach, but I could understand why she'd have those concerns. Because while Diop's novel does a great job of portraying the wit and sharpness of Alpha's mind, it's also hard to actually put that into words when the dialogue being presented is an internal monologue. When you're talking about a battle, you might not necessarily know what's going on in the soldiers' heads unless they were able to conduct an interview, or if they got the opportunity, they might not have. In this, because of the way the narrative is presented, we have that opportunity. But at the same time, that narrative also contradicts, not rather contradicts, but rather critiques that view. Because this whole time that we're being led, we're being presented as Diop as being very critical, very well-thinking, well-mannered, and knowing in his action. And yet, towards the latter half, as mentioned by Professor Lauren, of the sexual assault that happens, it happens due to Alpha misinterpreting the affections given to him by one of his attendants at the hospital, or rather the rear front. As Alpha cannot understand French, he isn't sure of what the doctor's daughter is suggesting, but he relies on his understanding of human nature and body language as hints, but these turn out to be incorrect, gravely so. And I was also nervous to talk about that part, so I just left it out. As it also ties back into a historical narrative, as I'm sure that Professor Lauren might have mentioned, about the portrayal of Black soldiers as being savages and sexual assaulters, women, as I'm not sure if it was regarding a German propaganda poster that I had seen, or if it was World War I or World War II. There was a specific poster about concerns of preventing people from getting into the fatherland, of protecting the woman from these savages. I remember there was that imagery that I remember from a history class I had taken long ago on World War II. And that was all I had to say.
Thank you very much, Daryl, for raising some very, very pertinent and interesting points. Now, finally, before we hand over to our audience, Lauren, is there something else that comes to mind?
No, I'm still thinking things through. So let's move on, and then I can interject as appropriate with the audience.
Sure. Okay, that's perfect. So we have a comment from someone in the audience, but before I read that out, I'd like to sort of formally open the floor to our audience. So there are two ways in which you can ask questions or offer comments. You can type up a question or a comment on the chat function, which I will read out on your behalf, or you may raise your hand through the reactions function. And if you're comfortable, you can address any of the panelists or all the panelists directly. You only need to turn your microphone back on. And if you want to, please turn your camera on as well. So maybe while we're waiting for others to kind of gather their thoughts and bring their questions together, I will just read out what Isaac has posted on the chat. They write, on what Dr. Panchasi was saying, Alpha's enactment of colonialist tropes of Senegalese soldiers felt almost claustrophobic to me. He was able to see so clearly how exactly he was being used, but nonetheless felt trapped into enacting them. Okay, Neera Hakvel has raised her hand. Neera, go right ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One was that there's a book called The 3-Day Road by Joseph Boyd that you might be familiar with. And somehow this reminded me a fair bit of that book because it dealt with I think it was a Cree Native person from Canada with somewhat similar experience because he would also go out at night and kill the enemy soldiers. So there was a lot of resonance between the two. The other thing is that it really raised for me the question, as to who's really the sane person here. I think one of you mentioned that, there's the violence that's legitimate and the violence that's illegitimate. And why is this person's violence so illegitimate compared to the other, which seems equally insane and probably more so because it involves so many people. And the last comment I wanted to add was that I was recently listening to a talk by a Dr. Nolan. He's a historian of, and I've lost, there it is. He's also a historian of war. And he gave this talk called The Allure of Battle, where he talks about how generals and others, focus on strategy and then who's the hero and who did well. And really the truth of the matter is that if you look at wars over time, it's the attrition and the country that's able to bear all the suffering, and still stand up that ends up winning. And that if they would think more about the attrition that wins the war, as opposed to the brilliant strategy or tactics that wins the war, then they might reconsider how they going to war and how they actually think about war. So any comments would be appreciated.
Thank you, Neera. So it's open to you, panelists. Anybody want to address either the comment on the chat function or what Neera just raised?
I think I can give a point to what you said about the reality of war. I wholeheartedly agree with it, because one of the things I noticed about war is that there's a lot of symbolism. We often glorify heroes in war. We look for soldiers to prop up with the acts of bravery and feats of heroism, when in reality, the overall winner of war is the country that's left standing, really.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a battle in particular that I remember because of how not only amazing the bravery of the soldiers is, but also how it also symbolizes, which is the attack on Fraser. I believe it was a Russian-held bunker that was attacked by the Germans in, my notes are correct, it was World War I. The Germans had attacked this bunker using chlorine gas under the assumption that as the Russian soldiers slept, the gas would just kill them. And the gas was particularly deadly because it caused liquid to form in the lungs and you would literally choke on your own blood. And it also ties into what Roxanne mentioned about the idea of legitimate versus legitimate violence. That something so cruel, such as chlorine gas or mustard gas, would be sanctioned as, oh, it's a tool of war. It's normal. Whereas in comparison to Diop fighting an opponent one-on-one is seen as savage and barbaric. And going back to the battle of Oyster, or as it's better called, the attack of the dead men. It was named so because despite what the Germans had thought, the Russians didn't surrender. They didn't just die out. They got up and they took their bayonets and they charged the Russians, despite being outnumbered at least 3-1. They were there, they saw, as the Germans crossed these lines, they saw Germans rising up, coughing out their lungs, wearing their masks, and charging still. They charged them, and ironically, it had a sense of mysticism to it, because to the Germans, they were being attacked by dead men. They were being attacked by men who were bleeding from the mouth, frothing, who were pale, barely able to stand, and yet still fighting them. And because of this charge that they led, the Russians were able to actually chase off the Germans. And however, in a similar manner, that also ties into how Russia defeated Germany in the war by outlasting the Germans. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Daryl.
I was just going to come back to what Lauren was saying about the ending. And I know that sometimes people who come to these don't, and this isn't like, there's no test at the end. It's not like if you didn't finish it or haven't read it or whatever, it doesn't. So I don't want to wreck it, I guess. But I was really confused by the ending. And I think that's sort of somewhat deliberate. Like then I did some reading around and I thought, oh, did I just not understand what happened here? Like I should check. And then I checked in the English edition in case my French was just wonky that day. And so I think I can hold all of those endings. And I think that's sort of part of how I resolved it for myself, was that all of those things that you suggested as possibilities of what were going on, Lauren, are the case by the end of the book, and that we don't even have to choose between his lucidity and his madness, because we don't do that for non-colonial soldiers after World War I. Why would we have to do it for this soldier? And then even when I think about my own unease, I think that does have to do, like when I talk about how it worries me and things, I think we're in this moment, and in the French context, you know, they're in a moment where it's not until the 1990s that they began to even resolve the question of the fact that veterans from like colonial veterans had their pensions frozen like at the 1950 levels. So they were getting like 60 euros a month, and non-colonial veterans were getting 600 a month. Like that didn't get resolved until the end of the 20th century. And then, of course, by the time it did get resolved, so many of those soldiers were gone. And, you know, the citizenship of African soldiers who fought in the wars not being addressed until like 10 years ago, that conversation started. So I think, and on other issues that I work on in the French context, I'm always torn between this, like we're in a moment of recognition and of accounting for and thanking and compensating soldiers and others for their suffering, but also for their contributions to these grand events that are so much a part of the national mythology. And what does it do to have narratives out there that deviate from these are heroes too? And I, you know, even though I know that that's not how history works, that this is a moment when actually, and just even in the contemporary context, if we're just talking about the perception of Black men in the contemporary French context, which is not, of course, exclusive to the contemporary French context, but is a certainly more widespread issue. Like, what does it mean to have a narrative of extreme violence, possible like mental breakdown, sexual assault, like out there in the? So yeah, there was a moment when I even thought, I was like, oh, this whole narrative is Mademba, actually. Like I had a moment where I was like, what if it's that, you know? And then I realized that my attempts to resolve it were just part of the complications of this short book, that's okay, that I didn't need to know exactly what the resolution was. And even if Diop, like, even if I find that place where he says what it is, I'm still going to hold on to my multiplicity of resolutions, because that is my right as a reader.
Yeah, I like that, Roxanne. Thanks for excusing me from finding like the good resolution. I had just a couple of things sort of spinning in my head based on what people have said. Neera, your comment about if the planners of the war had ever thought about the cost of attrition versus the brilliant strategy made me think of Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, which I think actually is all about that question. And I believe the actors it's Kirk Douglas, and they're all American actors, white American actors. But I think it's a French court martial, if I'm not mistaken. It's set in World War I, and soldiers have been accused of cowardice for refusing to go over the top. And their commanding officer, who's fairly low down in the hierarchy, is defending them against the charge. And it's masterful because it asks us to think about that question too, and why the officers in charge were so blind. And then just going back to what Isaac typed in the chat, which I've been thinking about, and it's a loop still, I don't know how to get out of it. He was able to see so clearly how exactly he was being used as a soldier, but nonetheless felt trapped into enacting that role, right? But then he goes and takes the hands. And I read that as a deliberate seizing of agency because it so offended the Europeans. And yet it also plays right into their tropes about savage Africans, right? But isn't that partly why he was doing it? Like there's all sorts of reasons he's doing it, but wasn't that how he was trying to break out of that sort of planned and rigid role that his captain had prepared for him? So that's where I'm spinning on that. And now I see Tomas has a question, so I'll stop.
Tomas, all yours.
I want to really thank the panelists for this very thought-provoking and thorough discussion of the novel. And to me, one of the main points that was raised, how the dynamics of empire, race, and difference come into play here, and how the colonial soldiers are made to enact savagery, brought back in a very powerful way a time when as a teenager, I followed the coverage of the Falkland War, when the British reconquered the Falkland Islands in the early 1980s from Argentina. And one of the things that kept coming up was the British insistence that they used mercenaries from Nepal, from like Gorkha soldiers, and then they were deliberately meant to do this hand-to-hand combat and to strike fear into the Argentinian soldiers and to use their daggers to cut off their ears and specifically to create this kind of terror of very closely associated with who they were supposed to be ethnically and imperially speaking. I think Diop touches upon something very central that is not specific to World War I, and that has unfortunately had a very, very, very long shelf life and has cast a long shadow. I mean, we are, I think, very fortunate that we have several novelists who have put Africans in Africa at the center of their accounts of World War I. And it might be interesting to teach Frère d'Armes in parallel with Abdurrazak Gurnah's Afterlives, which is set in East Africa and is also about how people are damaged, how they are half destroyed, implicated, used by the Germans in this case in the war. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Thomas. Right. I see Sarah Walter has her hand up. I would just, before coming to you, Sarah, there's a comment plus question from a student I know, Lucia, who's in my class. So I'll read out Lucia's comment and question for the panelists, and you can choose however you want to respond to it. So Lucia writes, Darrell discussed why the trenches are compared to female genitalia. Alpha also describes the rumor that he should be feared by his comrades in sexual terms, with one line being, quote, the rumor spread-legged an ass in air, from page 32, and another line describing the rumor as her, from page 30. Why do you all think he describes this rumor or the others' fear of him in these terms? Do you think he's feminizing fear here, or is there something deeper?
I don't know if the question was directly addressed to me, but I can try and give my views on it. I found it interesting the way he described the idea of a rumor as a woman undressing herself, as it was both very visual, graphic, which got the point very quickly across. And it also showed the process of how a rumor starts. It starts off very small, it builds up, and it gets more brazen and brazen. As the soldiers in the book, I'm not sure if I wrote the exact specific page down, but they even go so far as to claim that Alpha was the one who actually killed Denver, and he ate his innards, his body parts. As for why the rumor is addressed as her, I feel that is also an aspect of war that is generally done. I don't know if I can say if it's specifically objectifying. I'm not sure, but it seems I've noticed how, in a similar manner to how ships are often named her, you have planes that are referred to as her. You also have the case of John Baptiste, who called his rifle a female name as well in the novel. I feel that it's a tendency in war for male soldiers to do this, though I can't say why. Maybe it's so as a remembrance of what they lost. As for the rumors and fear, this also ties into the fear that Alpha takes advantage of when he attacks the German soldiers, as the first thing he does is to strip them of their clothes, or at least their shirts. And he describes about how he takes advantage of the fear of their racist views that the Black soldiers are rapists, are savages, to strike fear into them, as he knows what he is going to do, but they don't know what he is going to do. And that fear sort of paralyzes them, even though he has already bound them physically. And in a similar manner, this fear is also present with his own comrades, as they fear what he will do to them, as they fear that, can he distinguish between friend and foe? As he's bringing in hands, how exactly does he get their hands? What does he do to the victims? Because they never see the bodies. And I also believe that in some degree, he is feminizing fear, as one of the greatest challenges to a person's masculinity is being assaulted in that manner. And it's a loss of power, it's a loss of dignity, and it's extremely degrading for anybody.
Thank you, Daryl. Would any of the panelists like to respond to Lucia's comment or question? Any part of it?
I just wanted to say one thing. I mean, somewhat obnoxiously, I guess, in retrospect, reference to books that for me were like essential graduate school reading, the Fussell and the Tavelite. And I really think, Lucia, you have the best students, Bidisha. I want some of these students. We talk about empire and French history too, FYI. So I just want to recommend, I mean, there's so much more literature out there, but for me, thinking about the way in which this, not exclusively, but predominantly masculine space that is produced, like we talk about total war, but we also talk about the trenches and that world as a very masculine space, and how it produces this very, like what Fussell calls this versus habit, this dichotomous thinking that gendered language is just like actual gendered bodies and sexualized bodies and those experiences, but also that language is a part of that, and that there's a kind of unprecedented turn to that. You're right, Daryl, like that's there before this, but that it's intensified through the experience of World War I. And then the Tavelite, I think, and this is just like my methodologies that I'm interested in, like in terms of thinking through sex and gender through psychoanalytic frames and trying to understand like what men go through and how sex and violence in wartime and how sex and violence are imbricated, I think it's really like it answers a lot of questions for me about everything from vocabulary to actual sexual violence that's enacted and racism, and how nationalism is kind of intertwined with that in the post-war moment. So I would just recommend those books.
Sarah's been waiting for a long time. Please go ahead, Sarah.
Sarah will wait. This is a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for gathering here today to talk to us. I'd also especially like to welcome History 146 students. So I teach a modern African history class, and we were so lucky to have this align with us. What a gift this is to consider the book this week, actually. I will be brief, but I do have a comment, a confession, and a question. I will be quick. The one comment I had is when Roxanne and Lauren were contemplating translation, it occurred to me that the eyes through which I viewed this work were actually like orality, that someone who had experienced history and communication in an oral format would be adopting these rhythms, these repetitions, these coming backs. And it offers us, from a more, certainly my own Western lens, would be one where I might expect a story to follow linearly. But in reading African oral traditions and oral histories, definitely that circularity, and also the opportunity that with retelling, you get to create another experience and ending. That was a really powerful way for me to read the book. I confess, I have not finished it yet because it aligned with weeks from World War I and World War II in my class, which leads to my question. When I originally assigned this work, the first few chapters, especially in the trenches, really evoked for me World War II and those moments of realization of who the we is and how that changes with different contexts. So in chapter 3, when he's moving through the different family names of, of Senegalese and Wolof families and saying, we've had this together, and yet, here we are. That really brought home for me actually things that I associate with World War II and nationalism and reckoning sacrifice abroad only to return to oppression at home. And yet this book is about World War I. So I'm just wondering in myself, I tend to just treat these distinctly like Tomas. I teach World War I as a 4-year-long theater in Eastern Africa, and I tend to neglect the tirailleurs. In those moments, I tend to invoke it for World War II. So those of you, I'm relying on you, who Daryl learned it, Lauren and Roxanne have learned it and teach it. Like, how can I use this to inform not just World War I, but some of these things I see that apply to our World War II moments? And I will stop there.
Sarah, that's a really big question. One way that I am tempted to deal with it, you're right. There's so many themes that carry over, both from this book into the Second World War, but also from World War I to World War II. And I'm at times tempted to teach the European 30-year war that happens in the first part of the 20th century, because from the German perspective, in any case, that's exactly what it was, with a 20-year interwar period. And we should add to Roxanne's recommendation of Male Fantasies that book is about proto-fascism. It's about, trying to figure out where the Nazis came from. And he goes back precisely to World War I, as so many other scholars have done since, right? So in that sense, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with making connections to the Second World War, because in so many ways, the problems that it exacerbates, whether they're taking place on European soil or affecting people in colonies around the world, only get exacerbated. They certainly don't get solved, right? As Roxanne reminded us when she gave us all those details about colonial versus non-colonial veterans in the 21st century, right? So that's my sort of immediate response. I'd be interested to hear what other people say, though, because I'm just one voice.
I would totally second what you're saying, Lauren, and it's true for the French case too. Like I mean, obviously in very different ways. And, you know, when I do France, like, I think the idea that it's a 30-year war and that the issues that you can trace leading up to the First World War, you know, are unresolved and exacerbated in various ways in the interwar years. And then kind of thinking of World War II as, well, not a do-over, but like a horrific replay with all kinds of new elements. Like I teach it that way too in the French context. And I was just thinking about, you know, these contradictory images of the tirailleur, and like with this book, which I've never taught before, you know, what will change in terms of those images that I track of colonial troops through both world wars. And there is like the shift and the kind of openness to revisiting veterans' pensions came because of really, like, Chirac, the president at the time in France, watched a World War II film about World War II about North African soldiers by Rachid Bouchareb, and he saw the film and was moved by it and was like, we got to get on this. I mean, it was literally that story. And so I think holding the 30 Years' War and thinking about all of these different vectors and ways that colonial soldiers are mobilized, forced into service, you know, exploited, treated unequally, presented as like put forward as kind of patriotic, like terrorists working in service of the nation, but then also deprived of citizenship and seen as like stupid and inferior and illiterate and naive and sweet and cute. And, you know, the one ad, the racist, you know, series of ads that went on well past the wars of, you know, the Senegalese soldier eating this rather disgusting banana chocolate drink called banania. This very famous set of images in France of the Senegalese soldier who's, you know, speaking that kind of pidgin French, that those images are all sort of part of something that carries from the 19th century when these soldiers are first, you know, created, when these first sets of troops are created in the 19th century, right through to the end of the Second World War, and that resolving some of that unfinished business is still trading on the contradictory representations from that period. Like, so I could see doing that and making those kinds of connections back to Sarah through that whole period, and trying to figure out, like, how do we understand colonial soldiers, not just the Senegalese so-called, which was just the label used for all West African, Black African soldiers, but how do we understand them in relationship to North African soldiers, and then what emerges as a fear of Islam. And then how do we understand them as, you know, good threats when used against the enemy, bad threats when potentially taking French jobs or killing other, you know, white soldiers, or being a threat to them or their women. Because at the same time in World War I, all of these laborers are also brought to France. It's not just soldiers who are brought, right? So there are laborers, and there's all kinds of, you know, questions about what they're doing with the women on the home front and the increase in crime in the cities. So all of that stuff transfers and continues into the Second World War. And then in the post-war period, there's this like real struggle about and overlap with concerns about immigration. So I think seeing those continuities is that just makes sense to me. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's how to teach it, I would think.
Thanks, Roxanne. We have time for about one more question or comment. I'm doing what I do in my seminars, is stare uncomfortably until someone speaks. Aaron Windle, thank you.
I'll speak. So it was just to basically share what I thought was kind of the most arresting and profound moment in the book for me was this. It plays off of the repetition of God's truth. And that moment, it's kind of early to mid novel, where Alpha starts to actually start to theorize what God's truth is, and takes this and basically says God's truth can't keep up with man. And isn't God kind of transcribing these horrific events? And I don't know what others might have made of that, but that was one of those moments in the book that just kind of made me stop and think, wow, it reminded me of Walter Benjamin's Angel of History on the Klee painting, where watching the horrors that humans produce, especially Europeans, in the name of progress, that it produces all of this, war and destruction and trauma and just awfulness. It reminded me a lot of that, and it just kind of stopped me in my tracks and made me just really appreciate what Diop was doing there. And I wonder if others noticed that moment and were struck in a similar way.
I think I can just say a little about that moment. I was also struck by that moment in a slightly different way, as I had interpreted it as a sort of moment where Alpha had almost lost his faith in God, as he was seeing all these horrors, all these things around him, and he was trying to rationalize how God could let it happen, how he could account for the fates of all these people getting killed horrible ways. But he managed to rationalize it as God trying his best, which is ironic given the idea of God.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think now is the perfect time for us to start wrapping up. First, let me thank our panelists and everybody who's joined us tonight. Thank you for making the time. Thank you to those who read all of the book or any part of the book or thought about the book and were willing to come here and engage with us. Thank you very, very much. This has been an extremely enjoyable and edifying experience for all of us, I would say. Just also to let our audience know that the history department has its public lecture series coming up in the spring, which also follows this theme of highlighting decolonization. We'll have 3 very exciting speakers and topics related to various aspects of decolonization for you. So please watch this space. There'll be lots of information sent to you. And if you look on the chat function now, our wonderful communications manager, Jonathan, is letting us know how you can remain abreast of the events that are coming along, and also who to contact if you want to be added to, or you want any of your friends or contacts to be added to our public events meeting list. So I'll a lot of information will be sent around. So again, I think we're ready to wrap up now. So good night, stay dry, stay warm, stay safe, and thank you so very much. And yeah, big applauses to our 3 of our panelists. Thank you so much for everything you brought to us today.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.